Hey, what's going on, guys? The Horror Man back with the next episode of my TV SCAREies. The Horrorman's TV SCAREies is a series in which I discuss horror-themed episodes of TV shows that are not typically horror-themed. This week's episode comes from one of my favorite TV shows of all time. Coincidentally, last week I discussed the Season 2 premiere of Married with Children, and this week I will also be discussing a Season 2 premiere. The episode is titled Heart of Darkness, and it's the first episode of the second season of The Wonder Years. Season 2 of The Wonder Years premiered with what is probably the darkest episode of the entire series. And although it's not as horrific as some of the other episodes I've discussed during TV SCAREies, I'd say it's still primarily horror-themed. The episode begins in Kevin's nightmare. He is walking within a dark cave. Kevin and Winnie are with him, but then they're not. Suddenly, he's standing in front of his entire class, wearing pajamas, with feet. He wakes up and gets on with his normal day at school, but then the following night, he has another nightmare. This time, he is walking in the same cave, alone, and all of a sudden, he falls in a hole. He lands on his teacher's desk in front of his entire class, this time wearing only his underwear. At school that week, Kevin and Paul begin interacting more with another student named Gary Cosay. He's sort of a loner, a rule breaker. While talking in class, the three of them get detention, and Gary forges notes for both Kevin and Paul's mothers so that they never find out. Later, Gary asks Kevin to hold a bag for him in his locker. Gary claims the bag is filled with supplies he will be needing for a camp out in the woods the following night. He invites Kevin and Paul to join him. Kevin immediately accepts, and Paul eventually does reluctantly. That night before the campout, Kevin has yet again another nightmare. He has returned to the very same cave from the previous nightmares. This time he's carrying Winnie. Her leg is hurt. He's trying to get her to safety. Suddenly, he is in front of his entire class, begging for someone to help. But instead of holding Winnie in his arms, he is holding a giant purple stuffed bunny. The following night, during the campout in the woods, Kevin and Paul bring snacks, and Gary brings cigarettes and beer. Before long, Kevin is smoking with Gary, and Paul is getting drunk. That's when Gary tells them about a nearby cave. Kevin, as you can imagine due to his nightmares, finds this unsettling. Gary pressures Kevin and Paul into checking it out, and the cave turns out to be a drain pipe. Regardless, they enter, and Kevin finds himself in the reality of his nightmares. Once inside, Gary tells them about a man who tried to explore the cave, but never came out. Later, only parts of his body were found. At this point, adult Kevin, who narrates the show, mentions how scared he was in that moment. And that's when a voice is heard from within the cave. It's worth mentioning that this episode was directed by Steve Miner, who also directed some horror films, including Halloween H2O, and Friday the 13th, Part 2. And Gary Cosay is played by Breckin Meyer, who has starred in a ton of films, including Freddy's Dead, The Final Nightmare. Heart of Darkness is definitely the darkest and most horror-themed episode of The Wonder Years. And it's always been surprising to me that this show never had any Halloween episodes. Of all the holidays featured, Halloween was never one of them. Strange, right? Which is a nice transition into next time on The Horrorman's TV SCAREies. The first episode in a month filled with horror-themed Halloween episodes. All throughout the month of October, every episode of The Horrorman's TV SCAREies will not only be horror-themed, they will also be Halloween-themed. And I'll be starting with a TGIF classic. You might think you know what it is. You might be wrong. Tune in next week to find out. Thanks for watching, guys. Be kind. Subscribe.